I've been a child and adolescent psychologist for licensed in Alabama for 37 years. And I sometimes like to put those credentials in perspective. My wife's a retired school psychologist, so our 3 daughters had 2 psychologists for parents. They were doomed from the beginning. They've actually done very well. They're all raising families and gainfully employed and doing fine. But I always think about years ago when our youngest daughter was still in diapers, literally in diapers. My wife and I went out on a date, left the kids with the babysitter, went out on a date, and we stopped at Food World in Irondale. I'll tell you how long ago this was. Remember when there was Food World in Irondale? To get diapers. And so we're checking out with a big old thing of Huggies or whatever, and my wife says, oh, it's to the cashier. My wife says to the cashier, oh, I'd be so glad we don't have to buy these anymore. And the cashier said, are you having trouble with toilet training? And my wife said, well, not really. It's just taking longer than we'd like, and it's kind of frustrating. So the cashier said, I'll tell you what we did at our house. We got a big clear plastic jar, and we put our child's favorite candy treat in it. And we put that in the bathroom on the counter. And if she went poop or pee in the toilet, and only then she could open the jar, and get her reward. And said that kind of took care of it in a week or two. So we get in the car and we're driving home. We'd already been married a long time, so it's not like we were talking to each other or anything. I remember it was raining, windshield wipers going, and I said, that's really a good idea. And so then there's another 5 minutes we didn't talk, and my wife, you'd have to know my wife to appreciate this. My wife said, between us, we have 5 degrees in child psychology, and we just let the cashier at Food World design a behavior modification program for us. So practical advice can be really handy sometimes, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about adolescence and relationships, and also in the context of social media. And I've got a PowerPoint, but I got some comments. If I have time, I'll actually do the PowerPoint, or at least some of it. I think one thing for us to try to remember during this time, junior high age and around this time, is that there's a really basic developmental process going on with adolescents that has to do with relationships. And when I say it's a basic developmental process, what I mean by that is it has to be accomplished in order to end up with a socially healthy kid. So most of us know roughly what that is. Until around puberty or something, the child's primary relationship, their sort of source of emotional support and nurturance, is really all about the parents and the adults in their lives. And that begins to shift during adolescence toward peer relationships. And we all learn that, at some point in Psychology 101, how important peer relationships become. Now, Dickey made a critical point, and he's dead right, as he usually is, which is that doesn't mean that the adults in the lives of the child aren't important anymore. And he's right. Throughout development, kids will say it's their parents that are the most influential people. Even at the same time, they're looking at the parents and telling them they're the stupidest, meanest parents ever. What they really believe is that they're the most influential, important people in their lives. But nobody can deny this movement toward, peer relationships becoming so important. And so I think of that business of trying to form peer relationships as kind of like a laboratory. So what happens in laboratories? Experiments, right? And experiments start out with lots of failures when you're doing a course of research. It's as much about your failures as your successes. We threw these things together in a apparatus, and it didn't turn out the way we liked, and so we're going to try this again. We're going to learn from it and try it again. And like any failed experiment, sometimes the room gets stunk up, gets filled with smoke. In worst case scenario, bad, maybe something blows up. How's this metaphor working out for you so far, by the way? So there's really lots of trial and error that goes on, and that's not really error. It is the process. So it's the laboratory of learning how to have successful relationships, how to be kind, how to deal with criticisms and personal attacks and all those things. So there are some things about that sort of laboratory, though, because we're talking about 13, 14, 15-year-olds that make it a little bit different. And one is all those kids are pretty much bad at it. You know, they're all doing the same thing. They're all learning how to get along, and sort of that process of trying to figure out how to live in peace and get along. And because they're new at it and they're not yet fully, you know, socialized, they can be cruel and on the other side, maybe overly sensitive. They can fall apart when they don't feel like they're getting what they need from their peers. And so you get a lot of emotional intensity. And most people think that's about hormones. And the best research we have is that hormones are really not a big player in that. It's really about just the difficulties of being new at something that's extremely complex, like how to get along with people. And that causes a lot of stress and strain and a lot of emotions. To beat this laboratory metaphor to death, you have a lot more accidents in an unregulated laboratory. And teenage emotions are not particularly well regulated, you know. That's something else you got to learn over time, you know. So even though it kind of makes us nervous when our kids are going through all that, the process is essential. And in fact, there's kind of two ways for it to go wrong in broad terms. Sometimes that business of starting to pull away a little bit from parents toward the peers, sometimes that can happen too fast and too dramatically. Then you have kids who are at risk of getting in trouble behaviorally, right, acting out, because they'll be running with the wrong crowd, as I've been saying for several generations, right? They're getting out ahead of themselves. Another group of kids, though, have difficulty pulling away from those parental contacts. Maybe they're shy and withdrawn and are slow to shift to those peer relationships, and those kids are prone to a different set of problems like anxiety and sadness and depression and so forth. And the last thing about the metaphor, I made a silly remark about sometimes things blow up. Let's be honest. On uncommon occasions, there really is an ugly, awful thing that happens, right? When peer relationships go sour. People can get hurt. People can get wounded, you know. So it's tempting, because we know it can hurt our kids and hurt their feelings at the minimum and hurt them in worse ways at the maximum. It's tempting for us to try to always be protecting that and trying to manage it. But we have to kind of let go of it in a way, because it's such an essential process. Another metaphor, I think I've told some of you before, I had a professor that said, Dale, it doesn't bother me that you think in metaphors, it bothers me you think exclusively in metaphors. So here's another metaphor. If a physician said to me, Dale, you have to have surgery, I would say, let's have surgery. And then he says, Dale, there's a chance that can go wrong, and you're going to suffer afterwards. It's going to be a difficult recovery, and there's an X chance you'll die on the table. I'll say, I have to have the surgery. He'll say, you do. I said, let's have the surgery. So the way that metaphor applies is sometimes we have to know that our kids are going to endure some suffering and pain in order to go through a process they must go through to develop healthy relationships. And if we, as adults, try to socially manage that ourselves, kind of control it by being our kids' cruise directors, then we're, in a way, interfering with the process. That makes sense? But that said, it's a terrible dilemma for parents. It's a terrible dilemma. All of our instincts are to sweep in and fix things and try to engineer it, but sometimes that's harmful. Which is, by the way, exactly why if you say to a child, you get upset because their feelings have been hurt, and you say to them, I'm just going to march up to that school, or I'm just going to call that mother, they will say, oh God, please don't, right? Because they know that you're in danger of interfering with the process and making it worse.